Well, it's good to be here again. It's been a long absence, so for us, we've been very busy. We've been away a couple of times and lots of people into our home as well, but it's good to be back to be here this Sunday. We're dealing with the disciplines, and I've missed all of that. So,
we'll discipline you later.
yeah, So whatever I say is not tying into something I've already heard here or whatever. It may even contradict some of what you've heard here. When we think of disciplines of the Christian life, we think of something very rigid, that we have to do. It's a discipline. But I want to suggest to you that the word I really prefer to use is rhythms of the Christian life. Because I don't think we're under harsh discipline. It's not a slavery. It's not a yoke, as Jesus said, that we have to bear. His yoke is easy. His burden is light. It's a rhythm that actually helps us. And it's interesting how rhythms are that way. They say that women in Africa that used to have to go and haul water, that carried the bucket on their head with a whole bunch of water in it across the desert sand, they said they developed a rhythm that they actually, in studying it, they realized that with the weight of the water on their head and the rhythm with which they walked, it was easier with the water than without. They were actually more energy efficient because of the sway of how they walked. And I think that's how we should view the rhythms of the Christian life. They're meant to help us, not to create problems for us. So I'm going to speak on Sabbath again, and I know that Andrea touched on that somewhat last week on the discipline of Sabbath keeping. And I wasn't here, so I don't know what she said. I've read some of the material that was handed out or is available on the back. It's good stuff, great ideas in there. Some of what I say may overlap what's been said. Some of it may underscore what has been said. Some of what I say will contradict what has been said. And the good thing is I was told that we're just doing audio. We're not actually videotaping. So if you hear something and you disagree with it, you come to me, I just say, well, you have no proof that I said that. Because you don't have a face tied to that. But as they always say, eat the meat, spit out the bones, okay? Two passages I want to draw attention to. In Genesis 2, you've heard this, I'm sure. Thus the heavens and the earth were completed, all their hosts. By the seventh day God completed his work which he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had done. Then God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, or set it apart, because in it he rested from all his work that he had created and made. And then the other one is actually the commandment out of the Decalogue from Exodus chapter 20, verse 8. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but on the seventh day is a Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter or your male or female servant or your cattle or your sojourner who stays with you. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, and he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath, and he made it holy. I woke up one day several years ago, and I had, no, actually, it was just recently. I woke up and my mind had been working all night, obviously, because I thought of a time several years ago when I had an excruciating backache. I had injured my back somehow, and it was so severe I couldn't actually stand straight. I had this kind of crooked posture and bent forward, and it just ached so badly. To make matters worse, I, at the time, drove a little Saturn. And, it's got those seats that you're always scraping the pavement with. And we were supposed to go to Vancouver in 2 days. And the idea of sitting for hours behind the wheel, all bent up like a pretzel, and then somehow getting out of this and having to uncurl myself and straighten up again, just made me actually want to cancel our trip. So in desperation, I called a local chiropractor and I explained that I needed some relief immediately, within 48 hours. And he was kind of sympathetic, and he wanted to book 10 appointments right away, and I said, I don't have time for 10 appointments. I just need it right away. Well, he said, come on in. He saw my stooped and painful posture and had me stretch out on his chiropractic table, and he kind of felt over my back and tried to find out where the pain was. And he said, I'm going to take and attach some electrodes to some muscles in your back. And he said, then I'm going to take and put some current to them to tighten up your muscles. And he said, I want you to tell me when it's absolutely at its max that you can tolerate. Well, this was kind of frightening. And he did this, and he started to crank up, and I just started to just wince. And finally, just in desperation, I said, stop. I thought I'd have immediate relief. He'd turn it off. He said, okay, we're just going to hold it there for 10 minutes. And he walked out of the room. And here I was laying in agony on this table for 10 minutes with this current running through my back muscles. And then he came back, turned off the machine, said, sit up. I kind of, don't feel anything. Stand up. Stand up. I don't feel anything. He said, take a walk from here to there. Take a walk. All's fine. He said, bend over. Bend over. I'm good. He said, you're good to go. I said, hold on. That's magic. How did that work? Well, he said, your muscle can only stay absolutely contracted for a limited time. And then it has to relax. He said, your problem was that your muscle was halfway in between. Just injured enough to always contract a little bit, but not enough to release. Now, I woke up thinking about that when I'm supposed to do Sabbath. And I'm saying, Lord, what's that got to do with Sabbath? And then I thought, an awful lot. Rest is always preceded by work in the Bible. That's the amazing thing. Sabbath can only follow work. And if you never really work hard, you'll never really know Sabbath rest, actually. There are countless people that I see. I'm a mall walker now that I'm retired. We go almost every day and walk laps in the mall to get exercise. It's amazing how you have to generate exercise when you're retired. And we get there early and we see people that have to show up when the mall opens, but nobody else is prepared to shop yet. And they sit there on their and 2 hours later, they're still sitting there on their phone, bored to tears, because nobody walks in their stores most of the time. Now, if that's the limit of your work, you will never know Sabbath, actually. Because when you go home, what do? Right? Same thing. There is no rhythm to that. It's nothing different than you've already had all day. If you're underworked, like many people are in our culture, you will go through life with contracted muscles that never really are tightened enough to relax. A Jew begins his Sabbath with a prayer. And the interesting thing is, he doesn't pray thanking God for the Sabbath. He thanks God that he's been able to work. And then he begins or ends his Sabbath by thanking God that he can go back to work. He realizes that Sabbath is just a break in the midst of what is the normal of life, which is work. Sabbath in the Bible begins with work, actually. God worked for 6 days, and then he could rest. I don't know what he had done before creation week. Maybe he was like a retired old guy that just wondered what to do with his days. And one day just flowed into the next like mine do now. And no day actually seems overly special. I don't feel like I need a Sabbath because I'm not working very hard. I'm in my Jubilee. I've worked for 50 years. I'm in my year of Jubilee. Even in eternity, our Sabbath follows what? A lifetime of work. By the sweat of your brow you shall labor. That's what our earthly sojourn is. And then we'll get Sabbath rest. I found it interesting watching people in the last few years that the most tired people I generally meet are those people who don't have enough work. Many people have jobs, somebody said, that are too small for their spirits. I don't hear of surgeons that say, I need a Sabbath. I don't hear of CEOs that say, you know, I'm running this big multi-corporation, I need a Sabbath. It's people, the most tired people are the people who don't have enough work. So that when they actually get a rest, they rest. Now, I'm not saying that Sabbath is wrong. I'm just saying Sabbath, to be appreciated, has to be in the context of work. 6 days you shall labor is as much a command as the next part, which is then you shall have Sabbath and rest. The rhythm of life is to be like my back muscle. Work hard, then rest. Your involuntary muscles follow that, by the way. Your heart beats and then completely rests. It contracts, then rests. And if it follows that rhythm, it can beat for how long? How long can your heart beat? Easy, a century. Yes. As long as your heart follows that rhythm. It can go a long time. So the first principle I find on Sabbath is that Sabbath must follow work, not precede work. Here's the second principle, and I'm going to try to explain it from a paperback theology book written from the perspective of a 6-year-old. It's a masterpiece. It's a little book called Mr. God, This Is Anna. I think I've used this before. Any of you have read this little masterpiece? Yes, one. All of you need to pick up this little paperback book. Mr. God, This Is Anna. 6-year-old Anna asks her grown-up friend, Finn, what God created on the seventh day. And Finn replies, nothing. That's probably what you would say. But Anna retorts, no, he didn't. And Finn says, well, what did he create? He created rest. Rest is God's greatest miracle, she goes on to explain. Rest comes from finishing, so things aren't in a mess. God worked 6 days and he finished. Finishing creates rest. Now you know that somewhat, right? If you've had a major project and you finally finish it, how do you feel? Phew. You're done, right? You can rest. Now here's the problem. Our work often is never finished, right? As a pastor, I recall there was always one more thing that could be done, one more visit that could be made, one more phone call, one more book to be read, one more sermon that I should be working on. And that's with most people in their work. Work never actually finishes. So here's the key. Anna did hit on something important. Sabbath is an act of creation. You have to carve Sabbath out of your work. The Jewish rabbis actually believed it took a special act of creation to bring rest into being, because there's always more that could be done. So rest time must be carved into one's work time, because your work won't disappear. But you must sometimes disappear from your work. One of the translations of Sabbath, the word Shabbat in Hebrew, is to cease, or the one I like is interrupt. What happens if you are interrupted? Yeah, often. But what actually is happening when you are interrupted? Yeah, it takes over what you anticipated to be doing. And Sabbath, the meaning is to interrupt, to take over what you normally would be doing. It takes command. And we have to let rest take over a portion of our lives of work, or else work will always consume it. Now, how we create Sabbath, of course, can be very unique, both in how we do it, but also when we do it. The Jews, of course, use Sabbath or Saturday as their Sabbath. Interestingly enough, they began, though, Friday night at 6 p.m. and ended it Saturday at 6 p.m., so you managed to actually work each day somewhat. Muslims use Fridays, which I didn't realize until a mosque came up right across from Londonderry Mall, and every Friday you see people just streaming out from there to go and eat and shop or whatever at Londonderry Mall, but they're all clothed in their Sabbath dress. So Muslims still to this day use Friday. Paul actually says that the day is immaterial in Romans 14, verse 5 and 6, because many early believers were slaves and time was not at their discretion. So they had to just carve Sabbath whenever they could, whenever their master would allow them to have some break. Now, the reason, of course, we're supposed to do this is to develop this rhythm of work and rest, work and rest, work and rest. And the reason we do that, Moses gives in Deuteronomy 5, verse 12 to 14, is that Israel was delivered from slavery. And as a result, being in the image of God, if God could take a rest, we too are not under slavery. God isn't enslaved to his work. We are not to be enslaved to ours. But we are actually to take rest from our work. Now the key is, how do we rest? And this, of course, is areas of topic of controversy every generation, right? You've probably heard of people that maybe your grandparents or whatever told you stories on Sabbath. We weren't even allowed to pick up some scissors, right? That's from the Puritans. They actually had that. Some believed you couldn't play a game. You couldn't play sports. The rabbis formulated 39 categories of work, which they discovered when they went through the construction of the tabernacle. And based on the work that had to be done to build the tabernacle, they said there's 39 categories of work. And of course, each of those categories had subcategories, and on and on. Soon the list became huge of what you couldn't do on the Sabbath. But the idea was that they were creating something and building the tabernacle. So all the rules were based that you couldn't be creating. So even the Puritans saying you can't pick up a scissor came out of the idea that probably at that time, if you were doing something like that, you were either embroidering or you were sewing or you were creating something. It wasn't the scissors that was the problem, it was the creating that was the issue for them. What is interesting, though, is, of course, that the rabbis didn't allow you to create, but there were no rules against destroying, which to me is fascinating because actually destroying something could take as much work as creating it, I would think. So you could destroy things, you couldn't create things. So when Jesus heals a lame man on the Sabbath, that's creating. They were okay letting him be destroyed. If he had died that day, well, okay, that's just what you have to allow on the Sabbath. You can destroy something, you can't create it. Now that's Jewish legalism. Let's call it that, okay? It can go actually to an extreme. When I was in Israel, we were there over Sabbath at a kibbutz. And on Sabbath morning, we came to go up an elevator, and there was a sign, these elevators are closed for Sabbath. Use the Sabbath elevator. Oh, okay. What's a Sabbath elevator? You go around, oh, there's the Sabbath elevator. And we kind of wait. Oh, yeah, it's coming down. The door's open, you walk in. We want to go to, I don't know what was third floor. There's no buttons to push. The door closes automatically, goes up second floor, doors open, close. Third floor, open, close. And then it goes the other way coming down. Sabbath, right? You're not allowed to push a button. I think that's a little extreme, but good for them. They have a Sabbath elevator, in case you don't know which button to push. What does it mean to rest? Well, I had a lawyer friend, and I think rest is really individual, but he worked in a very large law firm, and he said, I work 6 days a week in a law firm using my mental muscles all week. And I had some fairly legalistic elders who were always upset with him because he would mow his lawn Sunday afternoon. And they'd notice it in the smaller community. So one day I asked him, I said, David, why do you mow your lawn Sunday afternoon? And he said, I work hard, 6 days a week already. And he says, mental work. The most relaxing thing I can do after I go to church on Sunday is get in my jeans. Generally, I wore his jeans to church too, but he said, to be in my jeans and just push a mower and work physically. He said, it's such a break. That was rest for him. I don't want to dictate what is rest and what is work. What I'm saying is, work, I think, is what you have to do. Rest is a break from what you have to do. Something that allows you to enjoy what you've created, just as God just sat back and, wow, isn't this an amazing world I've created? Look at all the galaxies and constellations and the stars. And he just enjoyed it, as though he was looking out over a beautiful landscape, except it stretched over the whole universe. So Sabbath is an act of creation. Third principle, you don't keep the Sabbath keeps you. A Jew's religious life did not revolve around holy places that he had to be at. It revolved around holy times. And in particular, after the exile, when they didn't have a temple, they still didn't have synagogues, but they still had to try to keep the Sabbath, and they realized Sabbath is about times, not places. It's around days of worship, around days of festivals. It's around Sabbath days and Sabbath years, but not around a building. Now, in our post-modern era, we're coming back to that. But in our modern Christian era that we've just basically gone through, the older of us, Sabbath was in a place, right? We had to be in church, in a building. And the more you were in the building, the more you actually had Sabbath. Well, I think we need to get back to thinking of Sabbath as times, not places. As a pastor, my time of Sabbath was never at the building. The moment I stepped into a church building, I was working. The moment your pastor comes into here, this place, other than now that you're having a bit of a Sabbath, you're working, right? You're not thinking, oh, this is my recreation rest time. No, it's my work time. So for me, my Sabbath was always on Mondays, when I could stay away from the building and I could do what refreshed me. And I didn't have to think about another book I had to read or another sermon I had to start preparing, because I still had 5 days ahead of me that I could do that in. So Mondays I chose as my Sabbath because it gave me freedom from anxiety over the next Sunday, while I still would have 5 days of work ahead of me. Now, every one of us has to decide how to carve Sabbath into our own lives. And in our culture, when we are working 7 days a week, stores are open 7 days a week, many people are working retail, we may not be able to make Sunday our Sabbath. You may have to make alternative times, but the key is to think of times. Sometimes you can be a place that's connected to it. I remember already 20 years ago hearing of a church in Sydney, Australia, which had no blue labor laws because of much more secular culture there. And this church in Sydney, Australia, had church 7 days a week. And you chose whether you were part of the Sunday congregation or the Monday congregation or the Tuesday congregation, because they realized that people have all different days that they aren't working and days that they are working. But the idea was that they tried to accommodate people at different times. The purpose of Sabbath time was to make it holy, which meant to make it distinct. It's to be different as a time of rest. But not so that the rest of the week could be profane or secular. It was the Sabbath, it was meant to be sanctified time so that all time could be sanctified. It's similar, kind of like a wedding. A wedding is only a day, right? But after that, it changes your life, because from there on you're married. And Sabbath is meant to be the same. It's to remind you you are God's people, so that you live differently all the rest of the time. So the Sabbath keeps you by instilling a mindset and lifestyle that honors God in all of your life. Then I'm going to close with a final principle. Sabbath is meant to honor the Lord of the Sabbath. Jesus said that the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath, which is what the Pharisees thought. But then he made this interesting addition to it. He said, for I am the Lord of the Sabbath. Now, what did he mean by that in Matthew 12:8? That he's Lord of the Sabbath. Well, in Jesus' time, each day was named after a different Roman god. And we've kept some of those names. We still have them today. For example, Sunday is the sun god day. Monday is the moon god day, and so on and so on. And the Romans decreed that the god of the day decreed how you honored the god that day. And it wasn't the same every day. So you had to know the God of the day and what he wanted you to do that day. So when Jesus says, I am the Lord of the Sabbath, he's saying, I am the God of that day. I determine what you need to do that day, not anyone else. Because I'm the Lord of the day. It's meant to honor me, not to honor anyone else, not to honor any person, not to obey somebody else's rules. It's for you to know that you do what honors me. So what honors Jesus Christ on the Sabbath you take? Well, it certainly isn't what the rabbis would dictate. Certainly not what some legalistic church leaders would demand. It's not how rigidly you avoid any kind of work or how big of a killjoy you can be. Is God honored if you're with your family on the Sabbath? You think so? I think so. God says, then do it. Because I'm the Lord of the Sabbath, and I made that family for you, and you for that family. Is God honored if you go to church on Sunday? Well, I think so, provided you don't stay there all day and have countless committee meetings that day at the church and come home exhausted and say, I sure wish I wasn't a part of the church. No. Certainly can be part of your Sabbath. Isaiah 58 verse 13 that Roxanne read, said that the Sabbath was to be a day of delight. What delights you? It's not to be a day of gloom. It's a time to put on your festive garments and refocus on all that God has done, just as he did on after his creative week. It's a time to be glad you serve a God who said, you know, you're in my image. And I'm not a slave, and I don't want you to be a slave. So you can take a rest from your work. You know, I love a verse in Psalm 127, verse 2, where the psalmist says, and he gives to his beloved, even when he's sleeping. Do you know that you serve a God who can bless you even when you're not doing a thing? You're sleeping, you're resting. Isn't that amazing? God gives you your salvation really while you're sleeping. There's not a thing you can do to work for it or earn it in any way. It's just a total free gift. There's so many things God gives to us while we're sleeping. So we're never supposed to live our life as though everything depended on how hard we work. Our secular world can't discover that. They can't believe that. But God can bless us when we're doing nothing. That's the amazing thing. But we need the time that refreshes us. In Exodus chapter 23, verse 12 and 13, where Moses again reiterates the idea of Sabbath, he says, I want you to take it so your soul will be refreshed. And the interesting thing in the Hebrew word, it means resouled. The world wants to take away your soul. Jesus talked about that. He says, you can work to gain the whole world, but you'd lose your soul. And God says, I don't want that for you. I want you to be resouled. Because the world always wants to steal your soul. And so the Sabbath is meant to keep you and to keep your soul. I remember one of our holidays, we were out east. My favorite place is the Maritimes. I remember touring the coal mine in Springfield, Nova Scotia. And the guide on the tour talked about the mules and the donkeys they used to pull the coal along the rail beds in the mine. And he said, if you take an animal that once has its sight and take it down into the mine, you have to take it up once a week so that it's going to keep its sight. And as it loses its sight, it gets very afraid and fidgety because it's used to seeing. So he said what they ended up doing was any mares that were pregnant, they would just give birth in the mine, because the foal would never develop its sight and never discover what it had lost. And I think about that. 6 days you shall labor, and your face may be to the black seam of the coal. But one day, you're to take a break and see the sun, so that you don't lose your spiritual vision. That's what Sabbath is about. Let's close in prayer. Father, we thank you for the blessing of Sabbath. In whatever way and whatever time we get to keep it, it changes in our world that doesn't honor you specifically on a day. But we can honor you, and we can still carve out time in our busy schedules of all the things that the world presses upon us to remember that we are not a beast of burden. We're not meant just to work. We're meant to enjoy the work of your hands and even the work of our hands. We thank you for the gift of Sabbath, and we thank you for the opportunity to have the times that cause us to reflect and remind us that we are spiritual beings, not just work animals. Amen.